Hazel Ashford was 21 years old when she stepped off a broken-down bus into the worst snowstorm Pennsylvania had seen in 40 years. She had no family waiting for her, no job, no room booked, only a worn backpack, $11 in her pocket, and the fading address of a town called Iron Hollow that had already forgotten she was coming. What she found that night was an abandoned library at the edge of the woods, its iron gates rusted open as if waiting for her. What she discovered inside would unravel a century-old crime that powerful men had killed to protect. A missing librarian who never truly disappeared. A grave with the wrong date carved into the stone. A diary written in 2 different inks, 80 years apart. And a wealthy family whose fortune was built on the bones of dozens of homesteaders, erased from every official record in Iron Hollow. By the time the snow melted that spring, Hazel would expose a conspiracy reaching from 1944 to the present day. She would face a man who had spent his entire life guarding his grandfather's darkest secret. And she would finally learn why, out of every lost soul in America, that storm had driven her to that particular town, on that particular night, to that particular library. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from tonight, and if stories about ordinary people uncovering extraordinary truths speak to your heart, take a moment to subscribe. What follows is inspired by the kinds of stories small American towns have spent generations trying to bury. The bus shuddered to a halt 3 miles outside Iron Hollow, and the driver said the words Hazel Ashford had been dreading for the last hour. "This is as far as we go, miss. Roads closed past the ridge." She looked out the frosted window. The snow had stopped falling, but only because the wind had taken over, lifting the drifts and throwing them sideways across a road that had vanished beneath a blanket of white. Pine trees crowded the shoulders like silent witnesses. The sky above them was the color of cold iron. Hazel pulled her coat tighter and stood up. The other passengers, a handful of farmers and a tired-looking nurse, watched her with the kind of detached pity reserved for strangers who had nowhere better to go. The driver waited as she shouldered her backpack and stepped down onto the running board. "You sure you got somewhere to stay, kid?" She nodded. It was a lie, but a small one. And she had learned long ago that small lies were the only currency the world ever truly accepted from girls like her. The bus door hissed shut behind her, and the engine groaned back to life. She watched the tail lights shrink into the distance until the storm swallowed them whole. Then she was alone with the wind and the snow and the dying light of a January afternoon in western Pennsylvania. She was 21 years old. She had $11 in her pocket, and she had nowhere to go. The town of Iron Hollow lay somewhere beyond the ridge. A name on a job listing she had answered 3 weeks ago for a position at a community outreach center. The pay was modest. The housing was supposedly provided. She had sent her resume, received a vague but encouraging reply, and used the last of her savings on a one-way bus ticket from Burlington, Vermont. She had not asked too many questions. she had learned not to. Her old life in Vermont had collapsed in slow motion. The community center, where she worked a small nonprofit that helped foster children stay connected to siblings placed in different homes, had lost its grant funding in October. By Thanksgiving, the doors were locked. By Christmas, her landlord had served her a notice she could not pay. By the second week of January, she had packed everything she owned into the same backpack she had been carrying since she was 15 years old. Hazel had been a foster child herself. 7 different homes between the ages of 4 and 18. She had stopped counting the goodbyes somewhere around the 5th move. The people who took her in had ranged from kind to indifferent to cruel, and the one constant in her life had been the certainty that nothing was permanent. Not love, not safety, not even her own name on a mailbox. She had no memory of her parents. The state had told her in the cold language of paperwork that her mother had died in a car accident when Hazel was 3 years old, and that her father had been unknown. There were no grandparents listed, no aunts, no uncles, no surviving relatives of any kind. She was, in the most literal sense, the world allowed alone. She started walking toward Iron Hollow. The wind cut through her coat within minutes. Her boots, second-hand from a thrift store in Burlington, were not built for this. The snow climbed past her ankles, then past her knees in the deeper drifts. She kept her head down and counted her steps the way she had counted them as a child, whenever a foster mother sent her to her room and she needed something to keep her mind from drifting into places she did not want to go. After what felt like an hour, the road bent around a hill, and she saw the lights of Iron Hollow for the first time. It was smaller than she had imagined. A scattering of yellow windows huddled along a single main street, a church steeple rising above the rooftops, a water tower painted with the name of the town in letters faded by decades of weather. There were no street lights at the edges, no welcome sign, no sound except the wind in the pines. Hazel made her way down the slope toward the first cluster of buildings. The community outreach center she had been told was located on Maple Street, 2 blocks east of the town square. She found Maple Street easily enough. She did not find the center. What she found was a boarded-up storefront with a faded paper sign in the window, the words barely legible beneath a layer of frost. Office relocated. Inquiries to County Office Pittsburgh. She stood there for a long moment, the snow gathering on her shoulders, and felt something inside her chest go quiet. It was not surprise. It was not even grief. It was something older than both, the dull recognition of a world that had once again chosen not to keep its promises. She turned and walked back toward the main street. The diner on the corner was open, its windows fogged with warmth. She pushed through the door, and a small bell rang above her head, and for a moment every face in the place turned to look at her. A waitress with gray hair pulled back in a tired bun nodded toward an empty booth. Hazel sat. She ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, a cup of coffee, and she stretched it out for as long as she dared. She watched the snow fall outside. She listened to the conversations of the locals' men in flannel coats and women in heavy sweaters talking about the storm, about the road closures, about a funeral that had been postponed. When the waitress came back with the check, Hazel asked in the gentlest voice she could manage whether there was a shelter in town, or a church that took in travelers, or anywhere at all that a person might stay for the night without money. The waitress looked at her, and Hazel saw the moment of calculation behind her eyes. The moment when a stranger decides whether to be kind or whether to be careful. "There's nothing like that in Iron Hollow, honey," the waitress said. "Nearest shelter's in Pittsburgh, 3 hours by bus when the roads are open." Hazel nodded. She paid for her coffee with 2 of her $11 and she left. Outside, the night had fallen completely. The storm had picked up again, and the wind drove the snow against her face like handfuls of needles. She walked because she did not know what else to do. She walked east past the church, past the closed gas station, past a row of houses with their curtains drawn against the cold. She walked until the house thinned out and the road bent into the woods. And then she walked some more, because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant something she was not yet ready to consider. That was when she saw the gates. They stood at the end of a long gravel drive, half buried in snow, their iron bars twisted by a century of weather. Beyond them, set back against a dark wall of pines, was a building she did not at first understand. It was too large for a house, too ornate for a barn. Its stone walls rose 2 stories high, and its tall, narrow windows were veiled in vines that had long since died and frozen against the glass. At the peak of its sloping roof, a small bronze plaque caught the light of her phone's flashlight, and she could just make out the words engraved upon it. Iron Hollow Public Library, established 1898. The gates were not locked. They were not even fully closed. Hazel pushed through them, and her boots crunched up the gravel path, and she climbed the 7 stone steps to the heavy oak doors at the top. She had not expected them to open, but when she leaned her shoulder against the door on the left, it gave way with a long groan, and she stumbled forward into a darkness that smelled of dust and old paper and something else, a presence that felt almost like memory. She closed the door behind her. The wind cut off as if a switch had been thrown. The silence that replaced it was vast and complete. She stood still and let her eyes adjust. The flashlight on her phone showed her a high-ceilinged entrance hall with a marble floor cracked by frost. Heave, a curved staircase rising to a balcony above and beyond the staircase, the dim outlines of bookshelves stretching away into the dark. She could see her breath in the cold air. But it was not as cold as outside. The stone walls held what little warmth the building still possessed, and the wind could not reach her here. She walked deeper into the library. Her footsteps echoed softly across the marble. The shelves rose around her 12 feet high in places packed with books that had not been touched in decades. She ran a hand along one of the spines, and her fingers came away gray with dust. In a small reading room off the main hall, she found a faded armchair beside a cold fireplace. She set down her backpack. She pulled out the blanket she had taken from her old apartment, the one her last foster mother had given her on her 16th birthday, the only thing in the world she truly owned. She wrapped it around her shoulders, and then she sat down in the armchair and she let herself cry for the first time in 3 years. She did not cry for long. She had never been allowed to. She cried until the worst of it had passed, and then she wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat. And she told herself that she would figure it out in the morning. She slept eventually, curled in the armchair with the blanket pulled tight around her, with her backpack as a pillow, with the silence of the abandoned library wrapped around her like the only kindness the world had offered her all day. She woke once near midnight to the sound of footsteps on the floor above her head. She lay still. She did not breathe. The footsteps crossed the second floor slowly, deliberately, the way a person walks when they know exactly where they are going. They moved from one end of the building to the other, and then they stopped. And then there was silence again. And then, after what might have been 5 minutes, or might have been an hour, she heard them descending the staircase, soft and patient, until they faded into a part of the building she could not see. She did not sleep again until dawn. When the gray light of morning began to filter through the broken stained glass of the eastern windows, Hazel sat up in the chair and listened. The building was silent. The wind outside had died. She rose carefully, pulling her blanket around her shoulders, and she began to explore. The library was larger than she had realized in the dark. There were 3 reading rooms on the ground floor, a circulation desk with its old card catalog still standing, a children's section with a circle of tiny chairs around a low table. Upstairs, a long gallery of shelves ran the length of the building with smaller study alcoves at either end. And at the back of the second floor, behind a set of double doors, hung with a brass plaque that read Archives. She found a corridor she had not expected. The doors were not locked. She pushed them open. The archive corridor was narrower than the other rooms, lined floor to ceiling with shelves of leather-bound volumes and cardboard storage boxes labeled in faded ink. The dust was thicker here. The silence felt different, more attentive somehow, as if the room itself were holding its breath. She walked slowly down the corridor, sweeping her flashlight across the shelves, reading the labels as she went. Town Council Minutes, 1898 to 1912. Property Records, North Quadrant. Census Returns. Newspaper Archives, Iron Hollow Sentinel. At the far end of this corridor, set into the wall between 2 ordinary oak bookcases, was a third bookcase that did not match. It was painted black. Every other shelf in the archive was the same warm, honey-colored oak. This one had been painted, and recently enough that the paint still had a slight sheen to it in the beam of her flashlight. And unlike the other shelves, it was empty, completely empty. Not a single book, not a single box, just bare black wood and a thin layer of dust on the floor in front of it that had been disturbed by the footprint of a boot that did not belong to Hazel. She crouched down and studied the print. It was a man's boot by the size of it, probably a size 11. The tread was clean with no sign of snow melt, which meant it had been made at least a day or two ago. She stood up. She put her hand on the black shelf. The wood was solid and cold, and at first she thought she had been mistaken. But then her fingers found the small metal latch hidden along the right edge, almost flush with the wood, almost invisible, unless you knew exactly where to feel for it. She pressed it. The latch released with a sharp click that seemed to echo down the corridor like a gunshot. And then, with a soft, mechanical groan, the entire bookcase swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a small, dark room behind it. Hazel stood frozen for a long moment. Every instinct she had developed over 21 years of learning when to walk away told her to walk away now. She stepped inside. The room beyond was small, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and no other doors. A single wooden desk stood against the far wall. Above it, built into the stone, was a narrow shelf containing perhaps a dozen books. The air inside was older than the air in the rest of the library. It tasted of paper and leather and the faint sweet smell of something that might have been dried lavender, set out a very long time ago to keep the moths away. On the desk alone sat a single leather-bound book. She approached it the way you approach a wild animal, slowly, with her hands held loose at her sides. The leather was dark, almost black, cracked with age. The brass corners had turned green. There was no title on the cover, only a small symbol pressed into the leather at the center, an image she did not at first recognize, a tree with deep, complicated roots that spread out far wider than the branches above. She sat down at the desk. She opened the book. The first page bore a name written in a clear, elegant hand. Mabel Crowfield. Begun this 14th day of September 1944. Below the name in the same hand in ink that had faded to the color of old tea was a sentence that made Hazel's breath catch in her throat and hold there. If a young woman ever finds this book during a winter storm, know that I have been waiting for her for as long as I am able to wait. The truth I have hidden here is meant for her and for no one else. Read carefully. Trust no one in Iron Hollow whose family name appears in the records I have collected. And remember that some debts wait a very long time before they are paid. Hazel read the sentence 3 times. Her hands had begun to tremble, and she pressed them flat against the desk to make them stop. She told herself that the sentence could not possibly be meant for her, that it was a coincidence, that Mabel Crowfield, whoever she had been, had written it for any young woman who might one day stumble into this room. And yet, she turned the page. The next entry was dated September 16th, 1944. My name is Mabel Crowfield. I have served as the head librarian of the Iron Hollow Public Library for 6 years. I am 24 years old. I am writing this account because I have come to believe that the history of this town is not what we have been told it is, and that the men who have been telling us this history have very good reasons for wanting it to remain untold. Hazel turned another page. The trouble began for me 3 months ago when an elderly farmer named Otis Mercer came to the library to ask if we had any old maps of the northern quadrant of Bramble County. He was searching, he told me, for the boundaries of a homestead his grandfather had purchased in 1903. The land, he said, was supposed to have passed to his father and then to him, but the deed had never arrived. His grandfather had died suddenly in 1909, and the property had vanished into a tangle of legal disputes that no one in his family had ever been able to untangle. He asked me with the kind of patient hope that I have come to recognize as the most painful kind, whether there might be old records that could prove the land had ever belonged to his family at all. I told him I would look. That is how it began. Hazel read on. The entries were long, careful, full of detail. Mabel Crowfield had been a methodical woman. She had spent the autumn of 1944 quietly searching the library's archives, the town hall records, the property registries at the county seat. She had found discrepancies, old maps that did not match new maps, census returns from 1900 that listed dozens of families in the northern quadrant of Bramble County, families whose names had simply disappeared from every subsequent record after 1910. Property deeds that had been recorded and then unrecorded and then recorded again under different names. A pattern slowly emerging of land taken from poor homesteaders, mostly immigrants from Scotland and Wales, who had come to western Pennsylvania to work the coal seams and farm the hard, rocky soil, and given to a small handful of families who had used that land to build the lumber and steel fortunes that still controlled Iron Hollow 8 decades later. One name appeared again and again in Mabel's notes. The name of the family that had benefited most. The name of the man who had in 1908 served as the county clerk responsible for recording every one of the disputed deeds. Thornberry. Hazel stared at the name. She had heard it already that very morning, although she had not yet realized it. The waitress at the diner had mentioned it in passing when she spoke to one of the older men at the counter. Something about Mr. Thornberry sending flowers to a sick neighbor. The name had been spoken with respect, the kind of respect that small towns reserve for the people who own them. She kept reading. She read until the light through the broken stained glass had turned from gray to gold. She read until her stomach was sick with hunger and her back ached from sitting hunched over the desk. She read until she came to an entry dated November 9th, 1944, that made her set the book down with hands that would not stop shaking. I was warned today not to ask questions. Mr. Cornelius Thornberry, the patriarch of the family, came to the library this afternoon and asked to speak with me in private. He was very polite. He brought me a small box of chocolates from his daughter in Philadelphia. He told me that he had heard I was conducting some kind of historical research into the early days of Iron Hollow, and that he wanted to offer his help. He told me that the library had received a very generous donation from his family for many years, and that he hoped this would continue. He told me that some histories are best left undisturbed because they involve the names of people whose descendants are still living and who do not deserve to suffer for the misunderstandings of their grandfathers. He smiled the entire time he was speaking. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten me. And yet, when he left, I sat at this desk for a long time and could not stop my hands from shaking. Tonight, I have begun to be afraid. Hazel closed the book. The light in the small hidden room had begun to fade. She had been reading for hours. Her phone, when she checked it, showed that the battery was nearly dead and that there was no signal anywhere in the building. The cold had crept back into her hands and her feet, and somewhere in some part of her mind that was not yet ready to think clearly, she understood that her life had just changed in a way she would never be able to undo. She stood up. She slid the journal carefully into her backpack between the blanket and the only other book she owned. She left the hidden room. She closed the black bookcase behind her, listening for the soft click of the latch. She walked back through the archive corridor, down the staircase, across the marble entrance hall. And she pushed open the heavy oak door, and she stepped out into the daylight. The storm had passed. The sun was rising over the eastern ridge, casting long blue shadows across a world buried in fresh snow. The air was so cold and so clean that it hurt to breathe. She stood on the top step of the library for a long moment, looking out across the grounds. And that was when she saw them. Footprints. Fresh footprints leading away from the library toward the line of pines at the edge of the property. Not her own. The size 11 boot with the same clean tread she had seen on the floor of the archive corridor. The prints came from the direction of the building, and they vanished into the woods. Someone had been inside the library while she slept. Hazel walked into town with the journal weighing against her back like something living. She found her way back to the diner. She used the last of her $11 to buy a bowl of oatmeal and a cup of coffee. She sat in the same booth she had sat in the night before, and she ate slowly, watching the door, watching the street, watching the faces of the men and women who came and went, wondering which of them might wear a size 11 boot. She was finishing her coffee when the bell above the door rang, and a tall man in a long charcoal overcoat stepped inside. He was perhaps 67 years old, with iron gray hair combed straight back from a high forehead. He wore a dark wool scarf and leather gloves and a small lapel pin in the shape of a pine tree. He removed his gloves slowly as he entered, one finger at a time, the way a man removes his gloves when he knows that everyone in the room is watching him. The waitress greeted him by name. "Morning, Mr. Thornberry." "Good morning, Marjorie. Just coffee today, thank you." Hazel went still in her booth. The man took a seat at the counter 3 stools down from where she sat. He folded his gloves neatly and set them beside his cup. He stirred his coffee with a small silver spoon, and as he stirred, he turned his head slowly and looked directly at her. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless, and they did not blink. He smiled at her. It was a warm smile, a kind smile. The smile of a man who had heard perhaps from the waitress, perhaps from someone else, that a young woman had arrived in town the night before with nowhere to stay. "You must be new to Iron Hollow," he said. His voice was soft and pleasant with the faint, educated drawl of old Western Pennsylvania money. "Please forgive me for intruding. My name is Walter Thornberry. I serve on several of the local committees here, and I have made it something of a personal mission to look out for newcomers, particularly in weather like this. May I ask your name?" Hazel held his gaze for a moment longer than was perhaps polite. Then she set down her coffee cup, and she gave him the small, grateful smile of a young woman who had learned that the only way to survive the kindness of powerful strangers was to never let them see what she was really thinking. "Hazel," she said. "Hazel Ashford." He repeated the name softly, as if tasting it. Hazel. What a lovely, old-fashioned name. "Tell me, Hazel, do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" She glanced down at her empty cup. She thought of the journal in her backpack. She thought of the warning on its first page. "I'm still working that out," she said. Walter Thornberry smiled again. "Well then," he said, "perhaps I can help." Walter Thornberry gave her the name of a woman who rented out a small room above her garage 2 blocks from the town square for very little money. He called the woman from the diner on his cell phone in front of Hazel to ensure that the room would be held for her. He pressed a folded $20 bill into her hand as he left, and he told her with the same warm smile that she should consider it a welcome gift from the town. He did not ask her any further questions. He did not ask her what had brought her to Iron Hollow, or what her plans were, or how long she intended to stay. He simply smiled and pressed the bill into her palm and walked out into the snow. Hazel took the $20. She thanked him. She walked to the address he had given her, and she met the woman, a quiet widow in her 70s, named Mrs. Pratchett, and she paid for 1 week of the room in advance with money she could not really spare. Then she left her backpack in the room, locked the door behind her, and walked back through the snow to the abandoned library at the edge of the woods. She needed to read more of the journal. She needed to do it in the place where Mabel had written it, and she needed to do it now before Walter Thornberry had time to wonder what a strange young woman had been doing in his town in the middle of a winter storm. She approached the library from a different direction this time, circling around through the pines so that her footprints would not be visible from the road. She came up to the building from the rear, and as she rounded the back corner of the stone wall, she stopped. In the snow, just beneath one of the broken stained glass windows, was a second set of footprints, smaller than the size 11 boots she had seen that morning, a different tread, fresh, made within the last hour or two. Hazel crouched and studied them. They came from the woods. They circled the building. They paused beneath the window. And then they returned to the woods by the same path they had come. Someone had been watching the library again. Someone different from whoever had been inside the night before. Someone who had come to look and to leave without going in. She straightened up slowly. She walked the rest of the way around the building. She climbed the front steps, pushed through the heavy oak door, and crossed the marble entrance hall to the staircase that led up to the archives. She had not been inside the hidden room for more than 5 minutes, the journal open on the desk before her when she saw it. There on the desk beside the journal, a small white envelope, sealed, unmarked. It had not been there that morning. It had not been there an hour ago. Someone had placed it there in the brief time between her leaving the library and her return. Her hand was shaking again as she picked it up. She slid one finger beneath the flap and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a Polaroid, the kind taken with an instant camera. The image was slightly grainy, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. It showed Hazel Ashford herself, curled in the faded armchair of the downstairs reading room, sound asleep beneath her old blanket, her head tilted against her backpack. The photograph had been taken from perhaps 6 feet away. The flash had washed out the colors, but she could see her own face clearly, her own closed eyes, her own quiet, vulnerable breathing in the dead of night. Someone had stood over her while she slept. Someone had taken her picture. Someone had developed it, sealed it in an envelope, and left it for her to find. On the white border at the bottom of the photograph, in small, careful handwriting, were 3 words. Do not read. Hazel sat down in the chair behind the desk. She set the photograph beside the journal. She looked from one to the other for a long time. And then, because she had nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to, and because some part of her had already begun to understand that this was no longer a story she could walk away from, she opened the journal to the page where she had stopped reading, and she kept reading. For 2 days, Hazel split her time between the hidden room and the small rented space above Mrs. Pratchett's garage. She read the journal in every spare hour. She learned the names of the families who had vanished from Iron Hollow between 1903 and 1910. She memorized the dates of the disputed land transfers. She began to understand the size and scope of what Mabel Crowfield had uncovered. And she began to understand also that Mabel Crowfield had not been working alone. There were references in the journal to a young man never named, only ever referred to as my friend, who had been helping her gather evidence. He had been a junior clerk in the county records office. He had access to documents Mabel could not see. They had met secretly at night in the cemetery at the eastern edge of town, where his grandfather was the caretaker, and where they would not be observed. The cemetery Mabel had written was the safest place in Iron Hollow. It was the last entry of that section of the journal. After it, The entries became more fragmentary, more frightened, more rushed. But Hazel had read enough to know that if Mabel Crowfield had trusted any place in Iron Hollow with her secrets, it was the cemetery. And so, on the second evening, as the sun was setting behind the western ridge, she walked the half-mile out of town to the iron gates of the Iron Hollow Memorial Cemetery. And she let herself inside, and she walked among the headstones until she found a small caretaker's cottage at the back of the grounds with a single lantern burning in its window. The door opened before she could knock. The man who stood in the doorway was tall and broad-shouldered despite his great age. His hair and beard had gone white long ago, but his pale blue eyes were clear and his hands were steady. He looked to be a man in his early 90s who carried himself like a man 20 years younger. He wore a heavy canvas coat and worn leather boots. He held the lantern in one hand and a chipped enamel mug of coffee in the other. And he looked at Hazel for a long, quiet moment, as if he were comparing her to a photograph he had been carrying in his pocket for 40 years. "You'd be the Ashford girl," he said. His voice was deep and slow, like water moving under ice. Hazel nodded. She did not ask him how he knew. He stepped back from the doorway. He gestured her inside with the lantern. "My name is Edwin Calloway," he said. "I've been waiting for you. Come in out of the cold. There's something I need to show you, and it cannot wait until morning." She followed him into the cottage. He closed the door behind her. And outside in the dark, beneath the bare branches of the cemetery, oaks, 1,000 headstones stood silent in the snow, and one of them set apart from the others at the eastern edge of the grounds bore the name Mabel Crowfield carved into its weathered granite face, and a date of death that was not 1944 and not 1950, and not any year that any history of Iron Hollow had ever recorded. The date carved into that stone was the 17th of October in the year 2018. Edwin Calloway set his lantern down on a small wooden table beside the door, and he poured Hazel a mug of coffee from a battered enamel pot on the wood stove. He did not ask her if she wanted it. He simply pressed the warm mug into her cold hands, gestured to a chair beside the fire, and waited until she had taken her first sip before he spoke again. The cottage was small and clean. A single room with a stove, a narrow bed, a desk, 2 chairs, and a wall of shelves lined with books that looked older than the man who owned them. A black and white photograph hung above the mantel. A young couple in their wedding clothes standing on the steps of a small country church, the woman holding a bouquet of mountain laurel. Edwin sat down across from her. He did not speak for a long while. He simply looked at her, his pale blue eyes patient and steady. "You found her journal," he said at last. It was not a question. Hazel nodded. "How did you know I would come here?" Edwin smiled. It was a small, tired smile, the kind that carried more grief than joy. "Because she told me you would. Not by name. She didn't know your name. but she told me that one day a young woman would arrive in Iron Hollow during a winter storm, with nothing in her pockets and nowhere to sleep, and that she would find the journal. And when she did, she would come looking for the cemetery, because the cemetery was the only place in the journal that was named as safe, and she would find me because I am the only one left who knew. Hazel set the mug down on her knee. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I think you'd better start at the beginning." Edwin leaned forward in his chair. The firelight moved across the lines of his face. "Mabel Crowfield did not die in 1944, he said. She lived in this town for 74 years after the night she was supposed to have disappeared. She lived under another name. She worked another job. She grew old in a small white house on Sycamore Lane that I helped her buy in 1952. And she died in her sleep on the 17th of October in 2018 at the age of 98. I buried her with my own hands in the eastern corner of this cemetery." Hazel could not speak. She stared at the old man across the fire, and the room around her seemed to tilt slightly as if the floor had shifted beneath her chair. "Then who was she?" she finally asked. "All those years, who did the town think she was?" "Eleanor Hartshorn," Edwin said, "a widow from Erie who moved to Iron Hollow in 1945 to take a job as the bookkeeper at the lumber mill." She kept to herself. She did not marry. She did not travel. She attended the Methodist church on Sunday mornings, and she walked her dog along the river in the evenings. And for 74 years, she watched the Thornberry family run this town from a distance of 3 blocks, and they never once recognized her face. "How?" Edwin gestured at the photograph above the mantel. "She was not a vain woman, but she was a careful one. In 1944, after she went into hiding, she cut her hair and dyed it. She wore plain glasses she did not need. She gained a little weight on purpose. She changed the way she walked, the way she spoke. By the time she had been Eleanor Hartshorn for 5 years, she had become Eleanor Hartshorn so completely that even I, who knew the truth, sometimes had to remind myself of it. She used to say that the safest disguise was the one you stopped noticing yourself." Hazel looked at the photograph more closely. The young woman in the wedding picture had the same elegant cursive penmanship she had been reading for the last 2 days. The same careful hands, the same quiet, steady gaze. "That's her," she said softly. Edwin nodded. "That's her. The picture was taken in 1942, 2 years before she ran. The young man is my older brother, Theodore. He was the friend she mentions in the journal. He was the junior clerk at the county records office. They were engaged to be married in the spring of 1945. "What happened to him?" Edwin's eyes did not leave the photograph. "He drowned in the Allegheny River in December of 1944. The official report said he had been drinking and had slipped on the ice while walking home from the office. He was 23 years old. He did not drink. He was the most careful young man I ever knew."
I was 13 years old when they pulled him out of the water, and I have spent the rest of my life knowing that he was killed because he found something in the records office that the Thornberrys did not want found.
The fire popped softly. A log shifted and settled. That's why she ran, Hazel said.
That's why she ran. Cornelius Thornberry came to her 2 weeks after Theodore died. He told her in that same gentle voice the family has always used for these things, that she was the only one left who knew. He told her that she had a choice. She could leave Iron Hollow that night on the last train south with nothing but the clothes on her back, and she could promise never to return and never to speak of any of it, and she would be allowed to live. Or she could refuse and she would suffer the same accident that Theodore had suffered. He gave her until dawn to decide. And she ran. She made him believe she ran. She packed a bag. She bought a ticket to Philadelphia. She boarded the train, and she rode it as far as the next station, and she got off, and she walked through the woods for 2 days and 2 nights until she came back to Iron Hollow from the south. By then, the town had been told she had vanished. The library was closed. Her belongings had been packed up and stored, and in a small boarding house on the western edge of town, a new woman had arrived, a widow named Eleanor Hartshorn, with her hair cut short and her old self packed away forever in a locked trunk that she would never open again.
Hazel sat in silence. Why did she stay? Hazel asked. Why didn't she go somewhere safe, somewhere far away? Edwin looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw something in his pale blue eyes that was not patience and not grief, but something older and harder. Because the journal you have been reading is not the whole journal, he said. It only goes through November of 1944. There are other pages, other entries, written in another hand over the course of 74 years in a different ink. She kept writing. She kept watching. She kept gathering evidence. Every land deed that passed through the county clerk's office. Every Thornberry who took political office. Every old farmer who came to her in secret in the back of the church to tell her another story about a grandfather who had lost a homestead in 1908. She wrote it all down, and she hid it. And she waited for someone to come who could finish what Theodore began. He stood up slowly. He went to the wall of shelves behind his chair. He pulled down a heavy oak box bound with iron straps and set it on the table between them. He produced a small brass key from his pocket and opened the lock. Inside the box were 3 more leather-bound volumes identical in size and binding to the journal in Hazel's backpack. She left these with me when she died, Edwin said. She told me that if a young woman came asking after Mabel Crowfield, I was to give them to her and to tell her everything I have just told you. If no young woman came in my lifetime, I was to pass the box to my daughter, and she was to pass it to hers, and so on,
until either the right person arrived or the world ended. Mabel always believed the right person would come. She used to say that the dead are patient, and that patience is the only thing the living are usually too tired to learn. Hazel reached for the box with both hands. "You should read them tonight," Edwin said. "All three, but there is one more thing I must show you first before you do." He took the lantern from the table. He pulled on his canvas coat. He opened the door of the cottage and gestured for Hazel to follow him out into the cold. They walked together through the cemetery in silence. The snow crunched beneath their boots. The moon had risen above the eastern ridge, and the headstones cast long blue shadows across the white ground. Edwin led her past the older sections of the cemetery, past the soldiers' plots from the Civil War, past the small markers of children who had died in the influenza of 1918, until they came to the eastern edge of the grounds, where a single headstone stood beneath the bare branches of an enormous oak. The stone was simple. Gray granite polished smooth, with no ornament except a small carved image of a tree with deep roots, the same image that was pressed into the leather of the journal in Hazel's backpack. The inscription read, "Mabel Crowfield, 1920 to 2018. She kept the lamp burning until another came to take it from her hands." Hazel stood still in the snow. "Look at the date again," Edwin said quietly. She read it. 2018. 6 years ago. She whispered. 6 years ago. "Then who has been leaving the photographs? Who has been watching the library? Who tried to scare me away?" Edwin set the lantern down at the foot of the stone. He turned to face her, and the moonlight fell across his face in a way that made him look both very young and very old at once. After Mabel died, he said, the journals stayed where she had hidden them in the secret room behind the black bookcase. The library had been closed for years by then. No one went near it. I assumed her secrets would sleep there until the right person came. But 2 years ago, in the autumn of 2022, something changed. Walter Thornberry Cornelius's grandson became the chairman of the Iron Hollow Heritage Council. He commissioned a survey of all the old buildings in town. He sent contractors into the library to assess it for renovation. And one of those contractors found the secret room. Hazel's breath caught. Walter Thornberry knows about the journal. Walter Thornberry knows the secret room exists. He has not yet seen the journal itself, because the journal was not in the room when his contractor opened it. By the time he sent his men back to retrieve it, the journal had been moved. To this day, Walter does not know where it has been hidden or who moved it. He has spent 2 years searching. He has had men watching the library every night, waiting for someone to come for it. He has had men photographing every stranger who has set foot in Iron Hollow. And 6 weeks ago, His men told him that they had received word from a former contact in the foster care system in Vermont. A young woman with a particular name had just lost her job in her apartment.
Hazel felt the cold pass through her chest like a blade. "A particular name," she said. "Ashford," Edwin said gently. "He has been waiting for an Ashford to come to Iron Hollow for a very long time, because the families whose land was stolen in 1908 are listed in the back of the third journal, and the Ashford family is at the top of that list." The night seemed to grow still around them. Even the wind in the oaks had quieted. Hazel stared at the carved image of the tree with its deep roots on Mabel Crowfield's headstone, and she felt the long, slow weight of a story that had been waiting 80 years to find her finally settle into place behind her ribs. "I was never running away from anything in Vermont," she whispered.
"No,"
Edwin said. "You were being drawn toward something here. The job posting at the Community Outreach Center was never real. It was bait. They wanted you in Iron Hollow where they could find out what you knew. They did not expect that you would find the journal first." She closed her eyes. "And now?"
"And now," Edwin said, "Walter Thornberry has met you face to face. He has seen you in the diner. He has given you $20 and a place to stay. He has put his hand on your shoulder in the friendliest possible way. And tomorrow morning or the morning after, he will invite you to dinner. He will ask you very gently what you have found in the old library. And depending on your answer, he will decide what to do with you."
Hazel opened her eyes. She looked at the old man across the headstone, and she said the words that for the first time in her 21 years on the earth, she meant with the entirety of her heart. "Then I had better know everything before he asks me anything." Edwin walked her home along a narrow trail through the pines that brought her 20 minutes later to the alley behind Mrs. Pratchett's garage, without her ever having to set foot on a public street. He left her at the bottom of the wooden stairs that led up to her rented room.
"Lock the door behind you," he said. "Cover the window with the blanket. Read with only one candle. And whatever you do, do not open the door for anyone until I come for you in the morning." She climbed the stairs alone. She let herself in. She did exactly as he had told her. And by the pale light of a single candle, with the wind rattling the loose pane of glass above her bed, Hazel Ashford opened the oak box, and she began to read.
The first journal in the box was Mabel's. She had read it already, but only as far as November of 1944. The remaining entries took her hour by hour through the final terrible weeks of that autumn. Theodore's death on the 7th of December. Cornelius Thornberry's visit on the 21st. The decision made at 3 a.m. on the 22nd to disappear. The train ride south. The walk back through the woods. The arrival of Eleanor Hartshorn in Iron Hollow on the 2nd of January 1945. The second journal in the box covered the years from 1945 to 1980. The handwriting was the same, but it had begun to change.
subtly in ways only a person reading both journals together would notice. The capital letters had grown slightly smaller. The flourishes on certain letters had been pared away. Mabel had been training herself over years to write in a hand that no one in Iron Hollow would ever recognize as the elegant cursive of the young librarian who had vanished in 1944.
She had kept watching. She had attended every town meeting. She had read every issue of the local paper. She had noted in the margins of her journal the marriages and deaths of every Thornberry, the political appointments of every cousin and in-law, the slow, methodical expansion of the family's holdings across western Pennsylvania. The third journal began in 1981 and continued in a hand that grew steadily more fragile until the spring of 2018. Her final entries were short, sometimes only a sentence, but they were all written in the same disciplined ink. The last one was dated the 4th of October, 2013, days before her death. The lamp grows heavy. I have carried it as long as I am able. Edwin tells me that I should rest now, and I believe him. The truth I have kept will outlive me. The girl who comes for it will know what to do. I have left a sign for her in the front of the first journal, written in a hand she may or may not recognize as my own. If she has the courage to read these words, she has the courage for what comes after. Hazel closed the third journal. She looked at the candle for a long time. Then she opened the back cover of the third journal where Mabel had said the names were listed. And there, in a careful column running down the page, were the names of every family whose land had been stolen in the great Thornberry thefts of 1903 to 1910. 47 names, 47 families, most of them Scottish and Welsh homesteaders who had come to the coal country of western Pennsylvania in the 1890s. At the top of the list, the very first name written in the original ink of 1944 was Margaret Ashford. Below it, in the same hand, was a single line of explanation. Margaret Ashford, widow of Samuel Ashford, lost the 80-acre homestead at Whitethorn Creek on the 11th of June, 1908. Two surviving sons, John and Henry. The family scattered. Their descendants, if any remain, are owed the return of the original deed and the value of every acre stolen from them. Hazel sat still. She thought of her own mother, Margaret Ashford, who had died in a car accident when Hazel was 3 years old, leaving behind no family, no records, no past. She thought of the long, quiet years of foster homes and garbage bags. She thought of the strange, weightless feeling of being a child who had no grandparents, no aunts, no uncles, no people. She had always told herself that her mother must have been an orphan herself, that the Ashford name was a thin and lonely one, that there was nothing on the other side of her short, small life but silence. She had been wrong. Her mother had carried in her name
the memory of a homestead at Whitethorn Creek that had been taken from a widow named Margaret Ashford on the 11th of June, 1908. A homestead that, if any descendants of the original Margaret Ashford were ever to come forward, would have to be returned, along with a century of unpaid value in an amount that would break the Thornberry fortune in a single afternoon.
And Hazel Ashford, 21 years old, alone in a rented room above a widow's garage in Iron Hollow, Pennsylvania, was the only descendant of Margaret Ashford left in the world. She blew out the candle. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, Edwin came for her just as he had promised. He brought her a paper bag with 2 hard-boiled eggs and a thermos of coffee. He did not ask her if she had read the journals. He could see from her face that she had. He simply sat on the edge of the bed beside her and waited until she was ready to speak. "He's going to invite me to dinner," she said. "Walter Thornberry. He's going to want to know what I've found." "Yes." "What do I do?" Edwin looked at her for a long moment.
"You go," he said. "You smile at him. You tell him that you found the abandoned library charming and that you were inspired to read a few of the old town histories on the shelves. You tell him that you have decided to stay in Iron Hollow for a few weeks while you look for work. You let him believe that you are exactly what he hopes you are, a frightened young woman with nowhere to go who has stumbled into his town by accident and who can be controlled with small kindnesses and small money. You make him believe that you know nothing.
And then, while he believes that we move, quickly, quietly, tonight, while you are at his house eating his pheasant and drinking his wine, I will move the journals from the cemetery cottage to a safer place. Tomorrow, I will introduce you to a woman named Verna Halstead. She is the granddaughter of my brother Theodore. She is 78 years old. She has carried in a sealed envelope in her family's lockbox a letter that Theodore wrote to Mabel in the week before he died. A letter that names the men who killed him. And after that, we will go to a man named Silas Redding, the chief of police of Iron Hollow, whose own father once tried to investigate Theodore's death and was forced to close the case.
Hazel nodded slowly. She wanted me to have the deed back. She wanted all of you to have your deeds back. She wanted the Thornberry fortune to be returned dollar by dollar, acre by acre, to the people from whom it was stolen. But she also knew that none of that mattered if the truth itself was not first set free. The money is the smaller thing. The truth is the larger one. The truth is what Theodore died for. The truth is what she lived 74 extra years to protect. The money will come in its own time. The truth comes first.
The invitation came at noon. A small white envelope slipped under the door of her rented room while she was out, written in the same careful handwriting she had seen on the back of the Polaroid in the hidden room. Miss Ashford, I would be honored if you would join me for dinner this evening at 7 o'clock
at the Thornberry house. My driver will collect you at 6:45. Please dress warmly. Walter Thornberry.
She showed the note to Edwin when he came to check on her at 4. He read it. He nodded. He gave her back the note and he said,
Eat lightly at his table. Drink almost nothing. Watch his eyes, not his mouth. And remember that you are not afraid of him. I am afraid of him. I know you are, but by the end of the evening, you will not be. Because by the end of the evening, you will understand that he is afraid of you. And once you understand that the balance of the room will change.
The car came at 6:45 exactly. A long black sedan with a silent driver in a gray cap. It carried her through the snowy streets of Iron Hollow, up a long, winding drive lined with hemlocks to a stone house at the top of a hill that looked down on the entire town. Walter Thornberry met her at the door himself. He took her coat. He led her into a dining room where a fire was burning in a marble hearth, and a table for two had been set with silver and porcelain that had clearly been in his family for several generations. He poured her a small glass of wine. He asked her how she was settling in. He smiled again and again, that warm, pleasant smile that did not reach his eyes. They ate, they talked. Hazel said the things Edwin had told her to say. She made herself small. She made herself charming. She let her hands tremble slightly when she lifted her glass, and she did not have to pretend. It was over dessert that he asked her the question.
Tell me, Hazel, he said, swirling his wine. I understand you have been spending some time at the old library at the edge of town. Such a fascinating building. A great pity it has fallen into such disrepair. I have been meaning for years to have it properly assessed for restoration. May I ask what you have found so interesting about it?
She looked at him across the candlelight. She thought of Margaret Ashford. She thought of Theodore Calloway, 23 years old, drowning in the Allegheny River in December of 1944. She thought of Mabel Crowfield, 98 years old, dying in her sleep in a small white house on Sycamore Lane after 74 years of patient, silent watching. She smiled. "Oh, Mr. Thornberry," she said, "I'm afraid I'm not very interesting at all. I just like the smell of old books." He looked at her for a long moment, and then slowly he smiled back. And for the first time, she saw something flicker in his eyes that was not warmth and was not kindness, but was the cold, quiet recognition of a man who has just realized that the girl across his table is not who he believed her to be. He set down his wine glass. "I see," he said softly. "Well, in that case, perhaps I might offer you a small token of welcome. A purchase, you might say. I am a collector of certain historical items, and I have heard rumors that the old library may still contain a few interesting volumes. If you should happen to come across, say, an old journal in your wanderings, I would be willing to pay you a very generous sum for it. Quite generous."
enough to set a young woman like yourself up very comfortably indeed anywhere she might like to go. Hazel laid her napkin on the table. That's a very kind offer, Mr. Thornberry, she said. But I don't think I've found anything quite like that. And if I did, I'm not sure I'd want to sell it. Some books just belong where they were left. The fire popped. The silence between them lengthened. Of course, Walter Thornberry said at last. Of course they do.
He saw her to the door himself. He helped her into her coat. He held her hand for a moment longer than was necessary, and his fingers were cold, and his smile had not changed at all. Drive carefully, Miss Ashford, he said. The roads in Iron Hollow can be treacherous in winter. People have been known to lose their way on them. Sometimes they are never found. She did not answer. She walked out to the waiting sedan. The driver opened the door for her. She climbed in, and as the car carried her back down the long, winding drive toward the lights of the town below, she did not look back. She woke to the smell of smoke at 1 a.m. She pulled on her boots, her coat, her hat. She ran.
The library was already collapsing when she reached it. Flames poured from every window. The roof had caved in over the eastern wing. The volunteer fire department had arrived, but the building was beyond saving, and they were focused instead on keeping the fire from spreading to the pines. A small crowd had gathered along the road, faces orange and red in the firelight, watching the place burn. Hazel pushed her way through to the front gates. She was not thinking clearly. She was thinking only of the journals. A hand closed on her shoulder. She turned. Edwin Calloway was beside her. His white beard lit orange by the flames, his face calm. I have them, he said quietly. Both the journals from the box and the one from your room. I went there an hour ago when I smelled the smoke from the cemetery. Your landlady let me in. They are safe. She nearly collapsed against him with relief.
Walter did this. Walter did this.
How does he sleep at night?
He sleeps very well, Edwin said.
He has always slept very well. That is the problem with his kind. It is also, in the end, going to be his undoing. They stood together in the snow and watched the library burn for another hour. When the roof finally gave way completely and the eastern wall collapsed inward in a shower of sparks, Edwin took her elbow and led her gently away. There is someone you need to meet tonight, he said. I had hoped to wait until morning, but after this, we cannot wait.
He led her 2 blocks east to the door of a small brick house with a single light burning in the upstairs window. He knocked 3 times slowly, then twice quickly. The door opened almost at once. The man who stood inside was perhaps 55 years old. He wore a dark wool sweater over a flannel shirt, and his hair was the same color as old iron, and his eyes were tired in a way that suggested he had been tired for most of his adult life.
A badge hung from a lanyard around his neck. The brass plate read, Silas Redding, Chief of Police. He looked at Hazel for a long moment. Then he looked at Edwin. Is this her? This is her.
Silas Redding stepped back from the door and gestured them inside. Then we don't have much time. He's going to come for her next. And when he does, I want to be ready. Come in, both of you. There is something I have been keeping in my father's old strongbox for 30 years, and tonight is the night I am finally going to open it. The strongbox was made of black iron, and it was older than the man who carried it. Silas Redding set it down on the kitchen table with the slow, careful motion of a man handling a thing that had cost his family more than money. He produced a small brass key from a chain around his neck. He turned it in the lock. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a square of yellowed muslin, was a sheaf of papers tied with a length of black ribbon. Beneath the papers lay a single photograph slightly larger than a postcard of a young man in a police uniform, standing on the steps of the Iron Hollow Town Hall in what looked like 1947. Silas lifted the photograph out first. He set it on the table between them. My father, he said, Daniel Redding. He was 26 years old when this was taken. He had been on the force for 2 years. He was a careful man, a patient man. He believed the way men of his generation believed that the law was a thing that protected the weak from the strong and not the other way around. He believed it until the autumn of 1962 when he opened the file on the death of Theodore Calloway. Edwin shifted slightly in his chair beside Hazel. He said nothing. My father reopened the case 18 years after Theodore drowned. He did it because a man named Walter Thornberry, who was at that time only 30 years old and newly returned to Iron Hollow with a law degree from Yale, had begun buying up the last few independent properties along the eastern ridge. The pattern of the purchases reminded my father of stories he had heard as a boy, stories about old land transfers that had never quite added up. He started asking questions. He pulled the old Calloway file. He went to the river. He talked to 2 men who had been in the saloon the night Theodore was supposed to have been drinking, and both of them swore on their mothers' graves that Theodore Calloway had not touched a drop of liquor that evening, or any evening they had ever known him. Silas untied the black ribbon. He laid the papers flat on the table. Witness statements, sketches of the riverbank, a coroner's report with an entire paragraph blacked out in heavy ink. He worked the case in secret for 6 months. He told no one but my mother. And one evening in May of 1963, he came home from the station and he sat down at this same kitchen table and he told her that he had built enough of a case to take to the district attorney. He was going to file the papers in the morning. He went to bed at 10 o'clock, and at 4 in the morning, the telephone rang. Silas paused. It was Cornelius Thornberry's son, Walter's father, Edgar Thornberry. He did not threaten my father. He did not raise his voice. He simply told him in a quiet voice
that there was a school bus that left the corner of Maple and 5th Street every morning at 7:45. That my father's daughter, my older sister, who was 9 years old at the time,
Rode that bus. That it would be a simple thing on a winter morning, on an icy road, for a bus like that to lose control on the long hill above the river, and that no one would ever be able to prove how such a thing had happened. And then he said good night, and he hung up the telephone.
The kitchen was still. My father did not file the papers in the morning. He took the file home. He locked it in the strongbox. He went back to work. He served as a patrolman for another 28 years. He never spoke of the case again. He died in 1991 of a stroke. The week before he died, he gave me the key to this box, and he told me that I would know when the time had come to open it. He told me that I would know because a young woman would arrive in Iron Hollow one winter, and Edwin Calloway would bring her to my door, and I would understand at last that my father had not been a coward. He had been a father. There is a difference, even when the two things look the same from the outside. Silas finally looked up at Hazel. His tired eyes had gone hard and bright. My sister is 69 years old now. She lives in Pittsburgh. She has 3 grandchildren. She is alive because my father chose to be a father instead of a witness on a single night in May of 1963. I have spent my entire career as a police officer waiting for the night when the choice he made could be unmade. Tonight is that night. Tell me what you need from me, Miss Ashford. I will give you anything I have. Hazel sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of 3 generations of held breath seemed to settle around the table. She drew a slow breath. I need to know what was in the file your father left, she said. I need to know who killed Theodore, and I need to know whether there is anything in that file that can be used in a court of law today. Silas nodded. He slid the papers across the table to her. There are 3 witnesses named in this file, he said. 2 are dead. The 3rd is a man named Harlan Boyce. He was 18 years old in 1944. He worked as a stable hand for the Thornberry family. He saw 2 men, both of whom worked for Cornelius Thornberry, drag Theodore Calloway out of the side door of the records office at 10 o'clock at night on the 6th of December. He saw them put him into the back of a wagon. He saw them drive east toward the river. He never saw Theodore again. He told all of this to my father in 1963 on the condition that his name would never be used. He is 98 years old now. He lives in a nursing home outside Erie. He is in failing health, but his mind is still clear. My father was the only law officer he ever trusted. He will speak to me if I bring him the right reason. And the journals, Edwin said. Mabel's journals will corroborate his story. The names match. The dates match. The pattern is consistent across every source. It is, Silas said, but it is not yet enough.
The journals are testimony from a woman the state has believed dead for 80 years, written under a name she abandoned. Harlan Boyce is a single witness whose statement, even sworn, will be attacked by every lawyer the Thornberry family can hire. We need one more thing, something physical, something that can be put into the hand of a juror who has never heard of any of us, and that the Thornberry family cannot explain away.
Hazel looked at the photograph of Theodore Calloway and Mabel Crowfield on the mantel 2 rooms away. She thought of the line in Mabel's journal, the one that had stayed with her since the first night. The evidence is hidden where the library remembers.
There's another place, she said quietly. Mabel wrote about it. The evidence is hidden where the library remembers. I thought she meant the secret room, but the secret room is gone now. And she wrote that line in 1944, before the secret room was even built. The library she meant wasn't this library. It was an earlier one. Edwin's head came up sharply. The Trinity Well. What?
The first Iron Hollow Library was a small wooden building behind the Trinity Methodist Church. It was built in 1882 and torn down in 1923 to make room for the parking lot. There was an old stone well in the yard behind it. The well had been there since before the church was built. It went dry sometime in the 1890s, and the town just let it stand. The library used to set out books on a long wooden table beside the well in the summers. The children would read there. My brother used to talk about it. He used to say that if you ever wanted to hide something in Iron Hollow, where no one would ever think to look, you should drop it down the Trinity Well, because the well remembers everything the town has forgotten.
It's still there. It is still there. It is in the back corner of the parking lot. The opening was capped with a concrete slab in 1955 to keep children from falling in. As far as I know, no one has touched it in 70 years. Silas stood up. We can be at the church in 20 minutes.
Not all 3 of us,
Edwin said. Hazel and I will go. You stay here. If Walter Thornberry has men watching the streets tonight, and he does, then the police chief leaving his house at 2 a.m. with the chief gravedigger and a strange young woman is going to be the one thing that draws the wrong eyes in our direction. You stay. You make telephone calls. You wake up the district attorney in Pittsburgh. You wake up the state historian. You wake up every honest reporter you have ever met. By the time Hazel and I come back with whatever is in that well, I want every honest person in 3 counties already on their way to Iron Hollow.
Silas hesitated only a moment. Then he nodded. Take my truck. The keys are in the bowl by the door. And take this. He opened a drawer in the kitchen cabinet and produced a small black revolver. He set it on the table. Edwin looked at the gun. Then he looked at Silas. I have not carried a firearm in 46 years. I do not intend to start tonight.
Take it anyway.
No, Silas. There has been enough killing on this account. I will not add to it. If Walter Thornberry sends men to the well tonight, then they will find an old man and a young woman with nothing in their hands but a length of rope and a flashlight. Let the world see what we are. Let the world see what they are. the difference is the only weapon I have ever trusted.
Silas looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the revolver and put it back in the drawer.
All right, go. Be careful. Be quick. The two of you have 1 hour. After that, with or without you, I am driving to the Thornberry house with the state police behind me. Hazel followed Edwin out into the cold. The truck was a battered red pickup with a snowplow attachment that had seen better winters. Edwin drove. Hazel sat in the passenger seat with a coil of rope in her lap and a heavy flashlight by her feet. The streets of Iron Hollow were empty. Edwin drove past the town square. He passed the post office and the bank. He turned left onto Cemetery Road and then right onto a narrow lane that led behind the Trinity Methodist Church. He parked the truck in the shadow of the church's eastern wall with the headlights off. They walked the last 50 yards in the moonlight. The parking lot was empty. A thin layer of fresh snow covered the asphalt. At the far back corner, beneath the bare branches of an old hawthorn tree, a circle of paler concrete marked the place where the well had been capped 70 years earlier. Hazel crouched beside it and brushed away the snow. The cap was a single round slab, perhaps 4 feet across and 8 inches thick. It was old, but not as old as Edwin had said. The concrete had been freshly poured. She could see the marks where a hand trowel had smoothed the edges. The lighter color in the moonlight came from the fact that this concrete was at most 2 months old. "Edwin," she whispered. He was already kneeling beside her. "They got here first," he said quietly. Walter knew, or he guessed, or someone in the church told him. Whichever it was, they sealed the well within the last few weeks. He set his hand flat on the cap and bowed his head. For a moment, Hazel thought he was praying. Then she realized he was listening. "It's hollow underneath," he murmured. "They poured it thin. There's still a space below."
He stood up. He went back to the truck and returned with a heavy iron pry bar from the bed. He worked it into the seam where the new concrete met the old stone rim of the well. He pressed his weight against it. Hazel pressed beside him. The bar bit into the concrete. A crack ran out across the surface of the cap with a soft sound like ice on a winter pond. That was when the shot came. It was not loud. A small, dry crack, no more than a dropped branch in the still air. Edwin grunted. He took 1 step backward. He put his hand flat against the side of the truck. And then he sat down in the snow with his back against the rear tire and his white beard tipped down against his chest. Hazel was on her knees beside him. Before she understood what had happened. "Edwin, I'm all right. Edwin, listen to me." His voice was tight but steady. "Listen. I am wearing a vest. I have worn one under my coat every day for the last 6 years since the week Mabel died. I knew this day was coming. The bullet did not get through. It hurts, but it did not get through. Listen to me. Do not look up. Do not look at the trees. They will be moving. They will assume I am dead.
get down behind the truck. Now.
She pressed herself flat against the side of the pickup. Edwin slid down with her, his hand pressed to his ribs, his breath coming in short, hard pulls. How many? One shot. Probably one man. Probably the same man who put the photograph on the desk. Walter does not trust this kind of work to more than one person at a time. What do we do? Edwin reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out an old brass key on a worn leather thong. He pressed it into her palm. You go, he said. You take the truck. You drive straight to the Thornberry house. There is a small library on the ground floor on the south side of the building. Inside the library, behind a portrait of Cornelius Thornberry, is a wall safe. This key opens it. Mabel gave it to me 40 years ago. She had been given it in 1944 by a maid in the Thornberry house, who had once been her friend. The maid is long dead. Walter does not know that key exists. He does not know that the safe can be opened by anyone but himself. You go now. While he is here at the well, waiting for confirmation that I am dead, his house will be unguarded except for one driver. Silas is already calling the state police. You will have 10 minutes inside that safe. Take everything you find. Bring it back to Silas. Do not stop for me. Do not look back. Go. Edwin, I can't leave you.
You can. You will. I am not in danger now. The shooter will come down to the well in a few minutes to confirm. When he does, he will find me lying as if dead, and he will go back and report. Go, Hazel. Go.
She did not want to. Every part of her did not want to. But she had spent 21 years learning to do the hard thing the moment it became clear that it was the only thing left to do. She took the key. She kissed the old man on the forehead. She slid into the cab of the truck. She put it into gear. She drove. She did not turn the headlights on until she had reached the main road. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She drove the long, winding, hemlock-lined driveway up to the Thornberry house at a steady, careful speed, the speed of a young woman who had been summoned, the speed of a young woman who belonged there. The front of the house was lit. The driver of the black sedan stood beside the car at the foot of the steps, smoking a cigarette, his attention on his phone. He glanced up as the red truck approached. He did not recognize it. He did not recognize the figure behind the wheel until she was already past him, pulling around to the side of the house, parking in the shadow of the kitchen wing. She was out of the truck before he reached her. She walked toward him with her hands up and her voice already speaking. Mr. Thornberry asked me to come back. He said he had something he wanted to show me. He said the side door would be open. The driver hesitated. He looked at her. He looked at the house. He looked at his phone. He had not been told anything about a girl coming back, but he had also been told less than an hour earlier that Mr. Thornberry was attending to a matter at the Trinity Church and would be unavailable until further notice.
And the driver was a man who had learned over 20 years in the Thornberry employ not to ask too many questions about matters he was unavailable for. Be quick about it, Zed.
She nodded. She walked past him. She opened the side door. The house was dark and warm and smelled of wood smoke and old leather. She moved through the kitchen, through a butler's pantry, through the dining room she had eaten in only 6 hours before. She found the library on the south side of the building, exactly where Edwin had said it would be. She closed the door behind her. She turned on a single small lamp. The portrait of Cornelius Thornberry hung above the mantel. A tall, lean man in a black frock coat with the same pale gray eyes as his grandson. The painting was hinged at one side. She swung it open. The wall safe was set behind it, black steel with a brass keyhole at the center. The key turned smoothly. The door swung open. Inside the safe was not what she had expected. There were no land deeds. There were no signed confessions. There was no cash. What there was stacked neatly in 3 thin manila folders was a record of obsession. The first folder contained photographs, hundreds of them. Surveillance photographs of an old woman taken across decades. The woman walking her dog along the river. The woman buying groceries at the small market on Sycamore Lane. The woman attending Sunday services at the Methodist Church. The woman growing older across the seasons, her hair turning from chestnut to silver to white, her back slowly bending. Every photograph was dated and labeled in the same careful hand. Hartshorn E, October 1971. Hartshorn E, April 1986. Hartshorn E, June 2003. The Thornberry family had been watching Eleanor Hartshorn for 50 years. They had never been certain. They had only suspected. The suspicion had not been enough to act on because Eleanor Hartshorn had been so perfectly Eleanor Hartshorn that none of the watchers had ever been able to find a single thing to prove she had ever been anyone else. But they had watched. They had passed the file from father to son. And by the date of the last photograph taken in the late summer of 2018, they had clearly come to believe that the old woman on Sycamore Lane might have been Mabel Crowfield after all. The second folder contained the deeds, 43 of the 47. Each one was an original document dated between 1903 and 1910, signed by a homesteader whose family had vanished from Iron Hollow within months of the signing. Each one had been forged. The signatures had been traced. The witnessing notary was in every case the same man, Cornelius Thornberry's grandfather. At the top of the stack of deeds, the very first one, was a single sheet of paper bearing the signature of Margaret Ashford, the widow, Hazel's great-great-grandmother. The 80-acre homestead at Whitethorn Creek sold on the 11th of June, 1908, for the sum of $42.
Hazel touched the signature. She traced the curve of the letters with one finger.
The third folder contained the most damning thing of all. It was a contemporary document. A single sheet of letterhead from the Thornberry legal offices dated the 3rd of December, 2023, addressed to a private investigator in Vermont. The letter requested a complete background check on a young woman named Hazel Marie Ashford, recently employed by the Lamoille Valley Community Outreach Center. The letter requested also that the recipient ensure through whatever means he found discreet that the young woman's place of employment should experience a sudden loss of operating funds within the next 60 days in such a way as to make her continued residence in Vermont unsustainable. The compensation offered was $50,000.
The letter was signed, Walter J. Thornberry, Esquire. Hazel sat down on the floor of the library with the letter in her hand. For a moment, she could not breathe.
The Community Outreach Center had not lost its funding by accident. The grant had not simply expired. Her old life had not collapsed because the world was a cold and indifferent place. It had collapsed because a man in a stone house in Pennsylvania had paid $50,000 to make it collapse, in order to drive her toward him, in order to identify her, in order to find out at last whether the descendant of Margaret Ashford was the kind of young woman who could be controlled with a $20 bill and a smile. She stood up. She put all 3 folders into her backpack. She closed the safe. She closed the portrait. She turned off the lamp. She walked out of the library, through the dining room, through the butler's pantry, through the kitchen. She let herself out the side door. The driver was still standing beside the sedan, still on his phone. He looked up as she emerged. She lifted one hand in a small, friendly wave. She climbed into the red truck. She started the engine. The driver said something into his phone. He began to walk toward her. She put the truck into gear. She drove past him. She drove down the long Hemlock Drive, and at the bottom of the drive, just as she reached the main road, she saw the first set of red and blue lights coming up the valley from the south, and behind them a second set, and behind that a third. And within 60 seconds, she was passing a convoy of 7 Pennsylvania State Police vehicles climbing the road toward the Thornberry house at speed. She drove back to the Trinity Church. She found Edwin sitting up in the snow beside the truck, his back still against the tire, his hand still pressed to his ribs alive. The shooter had come and gone. He had not stayed to check thoroughly. He had taken the old man for dead and had hurried back to report. Edwin smiled at her when she knelt beside him. "You got it. I got it. All of it and more. Edwin, he paid to destroy my life in Vermont. He paid $50,000 to a private investigator to make sure I would end up here. He has been waiting for me. He has been planning it for over a year." Edwin closed his eyes. For a moment, she thought he might weep. Instead, he laughed. A small, soft, tired laugh,
like a man who had set down a stone he had been carrying for the entirety of his life. Then he made one mistake.
What? He brought you here, and he did not know who he was bringing. She helped him up. She helped him into the truck. She drove him to the hospital, and then she drove to Silas Redding's house, and she laid the 3 folders on his kitchen table, and the 3 of them began to make the telephone calls that would end before the sun rose the 8-decade reign of the Thornberry family over the town of Iron Hollow. Walter Thornberry was arrested at 3:47 in the morning in the parking lot of the Trinity Methodist Church as he supervised the loading of a second concrete cap onto the bed of his man's pickup truck. He did not resist. He did not speak. He looked the troopers, later said, like a man who had been waiting for the knock at the door for so long that when it finally came, what he felt was less fear than a kind of cold, cracked relief. The well was opened the following morning. At the bottom, in a watertight iron strongbox that had been lowered down on a length of chain in the autumn of 1923 by a young woman who had not yet been born when Mabel Crowfield first wrote her name in a leather-bound journal, were the original land patents for every one of the 47 homesteads, signed by the United States Land Office. Indisputable, unforgeable, the legal foundation of every fortune Cornelius Thornberry had built upon stolen ground. The patents had been placed in the well by Mabel Crowfield's own predecessor at the library, a woman named Hetty Wexford, who had served as the head librarian of Iron Hollow from 1898 until her death in 1924, and who had quietly understood in the last year of her life that something was very wrong with the records that were passing through her hands. She had hidden the patents in the well. She had told no one. She had died of pneumonia 6 months later, and the secret of the well had passed unspoken into the keeping of the next librarian and the next, until it had finally come to rest in the hands of Mabel Crowfield in 1938. And Mabel had carried it alone for 80 more years, until the night a young woman with the name of Ashford arrived in Iron Hollow in a winter storm. The trials would take 3 years. They would consume the lives of 17 attorneys, 4 judges, and most of 1 term of a federal grand jury. Verna Halstead's sealed letter, written by her grandfather Theodore in the week before he died, became one of the most quoted pieces of evidence at the trial. Harlan Boyce, the 98-year-old stable hand, gave his sworn testimony from a hospital bed in Erie 3 weeks before he died. By the time the proceedings ended, Walter Thornberry would be serving a life sentence in a federal prison in West Virginia. 3 of his cousins would be serving lesser sentences, and the entirety of the Thornberry holdings in western Pennsylvania, valued at slightly over $400 million, would be placed in a court-administered trust to be returned acre by acre and dollar by dollar to the documented descendants of the 47 dispossessed families. Hazel Ashford received in the 18th month of the proceedings a court order returning to her the 80-acre homestead at Whitethorn Creek,
along with 116 years of unpaid value, an amount that came when finally calculated to slightly more than $9 million.
She did not move into the homestead. She gave it by deed to the township of Iron Hollow to be preserved as a wildlife refuge in the name of Margaret Ashford. She kept the money, but not for herself. She put it into a foundation which she named for Mabel Crowfield, which existed for the single purpose of restoring the abandoned library and operating it free of charge as a community center for the children of every family in the county. The library was rebuilt over the course of 2 years. The walls were the same. The windows were the same. The black bookcase in the archive corridor was rebuilt exactly where it had stood, with the small metal latch hidden along the right edge. The hidden room was preserved. Mabel Crowfield's journals, all 4 of them, were placed in a glass case inside the room where any visitor who wished to see them could see them. A small plaque on the wall above the case read, "She kept the lamp burning until another came to take it from her hands." Edwin Calloway recovered from the bruised ribs the bullet had given him. He resumed his work as the caretaker of the Iron Hollow Memorial Cemetery for 2 more years, until the foundation hired him at his own quiet protest as the first official archivist of the rebuilt library. He served in that role until the autumn of 2027, when he died in the reading room at the age of 96. A book of Welsh poetry open in his lap and a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. Silas Redding retired from the police force the year the trials ended and spent his remaining working years teaching ethics in law enforcement at the State College in Indiana, Pennsylvania.
Hazel stayed in Iron Hollow.
She bought with a portion of her own money that she set aside from the foundation the small white house on Sycamore Lane, where Mabel Crowfield had lived for 74 years under the name of Eleanor Hartshorn. She moved into it the autumn after the library reopened. She kept the furniture as Mabel had left it. She kept the books on the shelves. She kept the small framed photograph of a young couple on the steps of a country church that she had brought from Edwin Calloway's cottage and placed on the mantel above the fireplace.
On a Sunday morning in late April, 6 years after the night the library burned, Hazel walked from her house on Sycamore Lane to the cemetery at the eastern edge of town. The snow had melted. The first crocuses had pushed up through the brown grass beside the path. She carried in her hand a small bouquet of mountain laurel, the same flower that Mabel had carried at her wedding in 1942. She walked through the cemetery gate. She walked among the headstones. She came to the eastern corner of the grounds, where the great oak still stood, where a single gray granite stone bore the name of a woman who had outlived her own funeral by 74 years. She knelt in the new grass. She laid the laurel against the foot of the stone. She did not speak for a long time. Behind her, on the path, a small voice called out, "Miss Hazel." She turned.
A girl of perhaps 8 years old was running toward her, her dark hair flying behind her, a folded piece of paper clutched in her hand. The girl's mother stood at the cemetery gate watching with a small smile. The girl came up to her and held out the paper. "I drew this for you. Mama said you'd be here today." Hazel took the paper. She unfolded it. It was a child's drawing. The library with its high stone walls and its tall, narrow windows drawn in crayon. Above it, a yellow sun. And below it, in careful block letters, 4 words. "Thank you for staying." Hazel sat down in the new grass beside Mabel Crowfield's headstone. She held the drawing in her lap. She looked up at the sky.
She had been 21 years old when she stepped off a broken-down bus into the worst snowstorm Pennsylvania had seen in 40 years. She was 27 now. She had carried in those 6 years the names of 47 families. She had carried the silence of 3 generations. She had carried the lamp that Mabel Crowfield had set down. She had carried it the only way it could be carried, which was forward through her own ordinary days with her own ordinary hands.
She looked at the little girl who had brought her the drawing. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Margaret," the girl said. Hazel smiled. "That's a beautiful name." "My grandma said I was named after a lady who used to live near here a long time ago." "Your grandma is right," the girl smiled back. She ran back to her mother. The 2 of them walked away down the path hand in hand into the bright April morning. Hazel sat for a long while in the new grass beside the headstone. She did not cry. She did not pray. She simply sat with the drawing in her lap and listened to the wind move through the branches of the great oak above her. After a time, she stood up. She brushed the grass from her coat. She placed her hand for one last moment on the top of the gray granite stone. "I'm home now," she said softly. "Both of us are. You can rest." She turned and walked back through the cemetery, past the headstones, past the gate, down the path toward the small white house on Sycamore Lane, where the lamp in the front window had been left burning, as it would be left burning every night for the rest of her life, for any traveler who might come down the road in the dark, looking for the place where their story would finally be heard.